Welcome back. This is John Locke, and today I'm going to take a look at an article that was on SEO Roundtable uh, based on the Google Webmaster Central Office Hours with John Mueller. This was from July 24th. Before I dive into this video, I'm going to probably look at about 6 or 7 minutes of this talking about what Google actually looks for on the page. Title of this article is Google Figures Out What Users Want and like based on comparing your content to others, question mark. Before I go into this, I really want to clarify too. Google representatives, their job basically is to be the public service, customer service between webmasters and SEOs and people who manage sites and the Google company. And there are certain things that they can answer straightforward, and there's certain things that they're contractually bound not to be able to talk about. So we're talking about trade secrets, talking about patents, how the search algorithm actually works. So essentially what I'm saying is they can't give you the 100% secret sauce of how the Google algorithm works. And anytime that a Google rep says something, you need to read between the lines a little bit and determine whether they're saying things in a straightforward manner or whether they're giving you a clue, but they can't tell you out and out. Okay, so this particular hangout, John Mueller, he was saying, the question is, if you're comparing a diabetes health site to another, and if Google has indexed 500 similar sites, it can understand what a user should expect from such a site. And maybe it's about specific subtopics on that site. Maybe it's about showing more or fewer images. Maybe it's about what content is on the site overall. Now, I'm going to play part of this clip, and I'm going to let you know like what I think that he's saying and interpret what I believe he is saying. And like I said, I never take this stuff at face value. Some of the things they say are straightforward, and some of them are not. Okay, so let's pick up here. This is a little bit before we get to the actual part, but let's pick up here.
So that's definitely useful. With regards to the kind of the general question of should I add a big blob of text to the bottom of my content to make it a little bit more unique? That's something that we don't only see in non-English languages. That happens across the board. It's really common, for example, on e-commerce sites, on category pages, where if a site is, say, too lazy or not that invested in creating category pages that are
Okay, so one thing I want you to notice here is body language too. He's trying to think of a way to phrase this in a way that's not uh, telling people what works and what doesn't work. But what he's talking about is e-commerce category pages here, where people put text at the bottom of the page. Now, I know what he's about to say here, but I have seen cases where, for whatever reason, maybe the site just is a good e-commerce site, but I've seen places that have these chunks of text at the bottom of the category pages, and they're not as long as what he's describing, but it does maybe seem to help because they rank. It doesn't seem to hurt. I'll put it like that. Uh, so you can listen in for a second here.
actually really good, then we'll often see all of the products for that category on top, and then on the bottom in really small font, like 2 Wikipedia articles that essentially focus on those keywords in that category page. And from our point of view, that's something that generally doesn't work that well because it confuses us fairly easily. Because on the one hand, you're bringing all of this e-commerce content. So in the case of an e-commerce site with categories, you're bringing the e-commerce categories on top with all of the e-commerce content, and then you're adding this essentially Wikipedia article full of informational content on the bottom. And the goals of those pieces of content is very different. And
So I think what he's saying here is if you are adding text to an e-commerce page, what he hinted at too is if you're adding too much text content to an e-commerce category page, that the Google might try and read it as an informational page. So if you're adding content, don't add like 2 Wikipedia pages worth at the bottom because the algorithm might see it as an informational page instead of an e-commerce page. So don't go overboard. There might be a limit to how much text you can put there before it triggers something else in the algorithm.
that makes it kind of tricky for us to understand what this page is actually about. Is this something that we should show for people who are interested in buying something? Or is this a page that we should show to people who are interested in researching a topic? What is kind of the goal of this page? So that, from my point of view, is something that probably doesn't do that much good for a site. In general, for e-commerce sites in particular, my recommendation there would be to make sure that you have actually useful category content so that it's clear both to users and to search engines what this page is about. I can kind of understand the situation that you can't create content for every category page that you have. But at the same time, if you're just copy and pasting content like this or writing this big blob of text that's not meant for users to read, then that doesn't really do your site that much good either. So
Okay, so I'm going to pause right there. What he's saying is if you're copying and pasting a bunch of text, like from a Wikipedia article or anywhere that you find it on the web, it's not going to do a lot of good. And if it's not meant for people to read, the actual customers of that e-commerce store, then it's not going to do a lot of good. And I'm going to harken back to something here that we talked about in another video. Um, there's another video that we did called "What You Should Know About Google Core Updates," but uh, they talk about it. Hold on, sorry. Okay, content and quality questions. Does the content provide original information, reporting, research, or analysis? Uh, so on the e-commerce site, this particular thing that we're analyzing, uh, people are trying to find things to check out. And now Amazon does something very similar. Like they have reviews, they have user-generated reviews that are all about the particular products. But he's talking about original information. Don't just copy paste something from somewhere else and put it at the bottom of your e-commerce category page. That is what I believe he's saying is not going to help. So let's go forward.
my my general recommendation would be to more drop those kind of unnecessary blobs of text on the bottom. I would, however, still make sure that you do have enough useful content on that page. So
So he's saying that having text on the page is still useful.
if all of the content on the page is kind of these 2, 3 word snippets, like links to products within a category page or links to coupons on a coupon page like this, then there's not really that much useful information to kind of rank this page for. So instead of kind of going from the situation where there's not a lot of useful content to a situation where we're confused because of all of the content on the
What he's saying is don't have too little and don't have too much. Somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot for having text content on an e-commerce category page.
this page. I would aim for a situation where it's actually pretty clear what this content is about and what the value of the content is. So to write kind of reasonable category content rather than just a blob of text. The other problem with adding a giant blob of text is that frequently it goes into the direction of keyword stuffing. So even in situations where we're not completely confused as to the intent of the page, we quickly run into a situation that, oh, this keyword is mentioned 2, 3, 400 times on this page. Maybe we should be careful on how we rank this page for that keyword.
So what he's saying there is Google's algorithm uh, looks for how many times you're mentioning uh, a keyword phrase in a certain amount of text, like a keyword ratio. And if it's too high, then it's going to trip off a spam alert. And there is a certain threshold that you don't want to step over.
So keyword stuffing is one of those things which you probably want to avoid. So that's something that I tend to see more on these pages where you're adding just kind of textual content for the sake of having textual content, where maybe you heard some guide somewhere saying, well, you need to have at least 500 words on a page, and our category page doesn't have a lot of text. Therefore, we'll put 500 words of text on this page. If you go down that route, then quickly you're in the area of we should write SEO text for these pages, which means artificially including our keywords so many extra times. And then even if search engines don't get confused about the intent of the page, they'll be in the situation where we don't know if we should really trust this page for these keywords because it's obvious that they're doing keyword stuff.
So there are tripwires in place to alert Google that perhaps you should not trust this page. Trustworthiness. If it is too overstuffed with keywords, then that might be a signal that they should not trust you. Um, I will say too, if you want a guideline of how much text to add to an e-commerce page, look at some of the other category pages that are ranking and maybe don't exceed that, or look at how many products are there, how many product categories, subcategories, and look at how much text is on the page. You can run it through a word count um, tool and see that.
So I realize that doesn't help answer your question in a way that I say like yes or no, you should do this. Personally, I would tend to avoid going down this path and instead creating reasonable content instead of just a giant blob of text. Oof. OK.
Hi, hi, John.
Hi.
Yeah, John. I have the same related question in this content since we are talking about this content part. So my question here is, so let's say actually, as per the Google, so we are just focusing on user experience. Okay. So let's say I have a website like for gold rate. Okay. In that gold rate, we can't able to add much content. Of course, we can able to add, but since it's just a gold rate, I can just put what is the gold rate today in some country and with 2 3 line of a text. So is that a possible to rank in Google?
Sure. I mean, it's possible to rank in Google for any kind of content. I think if you're going out there with the intent of I want to write a minimal amount of content and rank number one for kind of competitive queries, then that's probably not going to work out so well.
What he's saying is there's no minimum word count. You don't need to have a minimum word count in order to rank.
But writing a lot of good content and writing really useful content for users, I think that's something that over time will work out for most websites.
So the thing is like we can't able to fight in SCRP with less number of content, right? So that will be the conclusion in this row.
Can you repeat that?
So you mean to say that the conclusion is if we are just having the minimum number of content, so we can't able to place in SCRPs, right?
Oh, like there is no word limit for content to be shown in search.
There's no minimum or a maximum word count. So there's no word minimum or no word maximum.
So it's not that you have to have minimum so many words on a page in order to be ranked. It's even so that if a page is blocked by robots text, it can still rank despite us not having any content from that page at all. So it's not that there's any minimum word length that you need to aim for in order to be competitive. Obviously, depending on the topic, depending on what you want to talk about for that topic, you might need to write more, you might need to write less. But that
Okay, this is where we're going to get into some tips here.
really depends on the topic. It really depends on the users, how you're fulfilling that user need. And sometimes less content is more useful. Sometimes more detailed content is useful. Sometimes a mix across a website is useful, where you have kind of introductory content and then more detailed content, which is longer. So it's not that we have any specific word count that you should aim for.
Yeah, so
I want to point this out too. This is something that we look at when we do SEO audits. We actually analyze what is ranking in Google, and there's a reason why I wanted to focus in on this is if you look at what's actually ranking currently in Google, you will get a good idea by looking at commonalities, meaning the topics that they mention, the topics that they cover, but also the elements that are in the page. And he's going to get into that in just a sec.
that is also based upon user experience.
I think user experience is a good way to look at it. Looking at maybe user studies that you do with your particular users. Assuming you're the expert in this field, you'll know a little bit more about which topics need more explaining and which topics need less explaining.
So I believe what he's saying here, he's not super clear on how to answer this because he doesn't know what topic the person asking this question is talking about. But what he's saying is Google, for any subject, Google, let's keep in mind too, that Google cannot evaluate who is an expert in a given category. But what it can track is whether people are satisfied with a page or not. And as a lot of people have theorized, they probably get those signals from people that are using Chrome. Makes a lot of sense. So if pages that over time in a given topic seem to do better, Google is going to look for commonalities in those pages. So if they mention certain topics, certain phrases, if they cover certain things more often, then those are probably written by experts. Got to remember, Google has no way of evaluating who is actually an expert in every single category on Earth except through analyzing user signals. So if it's looking for commonalities in pages that seem to have good user signals like long scroll depth, people seem to be satisfied with the results. Maybe they're bookmarking it, maybe they're sharing it, maybe they're linking to it. Whatever it is, it's analyzing that. And it's going to say what things are in that page. Now, we talked about this in another video called Machine Learning and SEO, Google Natural Language API. And here is the Google Natural Language page. You can cut a piece of text in here. You can analyze it. And like I said, you could even take, like this page. You could dump it in Google. You could analyze it, and it'll tell you, it'll try to extract the different entities out of the page. So you can see that there are different entities here that it's extracting, different phrases and whatnot. And it tries to analyze what's in the page. So that's one thing that it's talking about here with commonalities. And this is how it actually figures out who's an expert or what content is an expert.
So that's kind of where I would say, like, you should kind of know where you need to have more content or you need to have less.
Yeah.
John, can I butt in a little bit? If
Sure.
so, John, if you were a search algorithm, how would you, and what specific metrics would you use to figure out a good user experience on a website?
Um,
Watch the body language.
I don't know. I'd probably have to think about that a bit to see what would work well for me. I
The reason why he's smiling, he's trying to think about how to answer this in a way that doesn't tell how Google actually does this. I believe. So the question again: if you were a search algorithm, how would you determine what the best user experience for a searcher is?
mean, it's something where if you have an overview of the whole web or kind of a large part of the web, and you see which type of content is reasonable for individual topics, then that's something where you
If you see what type of content is reasonable for a given topic. So I'm going to go back and again, go back and watch this video on machine learning and Google Natural Language API. I'll link this up again, but again, it extracts these different phrases. This is actually how it does this. And it gives them different sentiment scores and different categories. So it actually gives it like sentiment, magnitude, and tries to impart meaning to these different things. So if it has good user engagement signals over time, then it tries to figure out what things those pages are mentioning.
could potentially infer from that, like for this particular topic, we need to cover these subtopics. We need to have this much information or more images or fewer images on a page.
So listen to what he said right there. He said, for a given topic, we're trying to figure out if you should have more images, certain images, less images on a page. Now, I will tell you, there is a case where I did this recently for a client. We were trying to get them to rank for a certain calculation tool. And one of the things that I noticed is all the pages that were ranking for that, or the vast majority of them, like 8 or 9 out of 10, they had not only the calculation tool, but they had an image of how the calculation worked. And published page, it had an image. It debuted pretty high. I took that image off because I wanted to replace it with a better put together image. And the ranking went down temporarily. And when I put the new image up there, the new illustration of how that calculation worked, that page went up even higher than it had previously. So there is something to what he's saying here. For a given subject, they're using some sort of image recognition or knowing that there needs to be some sort of visual explanation for certain types of pages. And this is why when we do an SEO audit, we're looking at each individual part of the page, of the pages that are in the top 10, because that gives us clues as to what needs to be on your page to make it rank.
That's something that perhaps you could look at like that. I'm sure our algorithms are quite a bit more complicated than that, though.
Okay. And anything new and exciting coming from the Google Search Console team that you want?
That's pretty much what I wanted to cover there, but the big point of what I'm trying to drive here is they're really looking at pattern matching. And in the first half of this segment that we're analyzing, they're talking about adding text to e-commerce category pages, and they're saying if you add too much, then Google tries to put it into an informational or like a blog post article, a type of category instead of e-commerce. And if you have too little, then there's not a lot to go on. So having a little bit of text on an e-commerce category page might be a good idea, but not to overdo it, because then Google's algorithm thinks that it's in a different type of intent. It thinks it's more informational intent instead of e-commerce. And then in the second half of this, what it was saying is a person was asking about word count. He said there's no minimum, no maximum. And then the other thing he was saying is how does it determine the best user experience? And what John Mueller was saying, in a way, as much as he could reveal, is he was saying that if you're the expert, if you're truly the expert, then you're going to know what topics to write about. Maybe you need to write more about this topic or that topic. And I do believe that Google looks at the performance of certain pages over time, because it's got a large set. It's got all the documents that it's crawled over the web, over its history. So if it puts it in a certain category and it has certain entities in it, certain things that are mentioned over and over, then it says this page is probably about this subject. So the pages that have good performance, user signals what is in common with those. Because again, Google is not an omnipotent God. It can't know who's an expert in like every single category on the earth. So it has to figure out how to judge things programmatically based on the data that is collected. I hope that makes sense. If you have a question about this, or if you have a comment, if you think, if you want to comment on this, just put it down below in the comments. My name's John Locke. My business is Lockdown Design and SEO. I hope you got something out of this video. I'll be back tomorrow with another video. And thank you to all the new subscribers that have come on recently. I really appreciate it. That's all I got. Till next time. Peace.